You're listening to the Knowledge Archives podcast. Welcome to the Knowledge Archives podcast. We're a group of students on a mission to learn from as many different disciplines of knowledge as possible. I'm your host, Madhav Malhotra, and today I'm glad to be joined by Dr. Yuval Engel, Assistant Professor of Entrepreneurship and Innovation at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. His research focuses on entrepreneurial decision-making in response to uncertainty, especially in regards to how practices like effectuation and meditation can help with this. I'm very excited to learn more about this specialized area of work today. So thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I'm very excited to learn more about your work. And to begin, I'd love to just ask you how you got started working here and provide a little bit of an introduction to what you're doing right now.
So thank you for having me. So I'm originally from Israel, where I grew up. I am, for the past 15 years, living in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, where I'm Assistant Professor of Entrepreneurship at the Amsterdam Business School, which is at the University of Amsterdam. I suppose that if I have to introduce it in this way, the overarching question or theme that my research has been about is why and how and with what consequences do entrepreneurs make decisions under uncertainty. So that was also my sort of initial attraction to the field of entrepreneurship, this sort of connection with uncertainty. I suppose that I have some kind of a personal drive that I need to explore more about this construct. And it also means that most of the research I do is around the very early decisions that entrepreneurs do, because this is where I suppose uncertainty is at its highest. And these are things like, how do entrepreneurs form relationships with other people when they just start out their business and try to look for, actually define for themselves what they're working on and how they do it. But it's also about logic entrepreneurs use for making decisions. And as a consequence of that, the type of difficulties that mainly psychological difficulties that entrepreneurs struggle with as they need to sort of navigate this uncertainty. More recently, I've also become interested in a set of decisions and challenges to the usual ways that entrepreneurs deal with decisions of that sort. I guess we'll get to talk a little bit later about what I mean by the usual way. And that's mostly around hiring or scaling the organization. I said I've started with the very early stage, and this is like the follow-up on that early stage, and there things are quite different.
Mm-hmm. And I know when we think about this area intuitively, people hear about what entrepreneurs do and they assume, that makes sense. It makes sense that they might face uncertainty, but it's a lot harder to understand that in a concrete level. And as I was mentioning, I really like your research because of that. I think it's very important to understand it at that concrete level. So could we first off start by defining what are the factors that contribute to uncertainty in entrepreneurship? What are some of the ways that their decision making is affected by that uncertainty, etc.?
Sure. So I guess we should first define what is uncertainty. Many people and smarter people than me wrote about what uncertainty is and different types of uncertainties, but I think I sort of like to simplify it a little bit into a simple definition, which is the perceived inability to predict something accurately. So if you're making a decision, at the time that you're making a decision, if you as a decision maker cannot collect the information that is needed to anticipate the possible outcomes, nor can you associate a certain probability to those non-existent outcomes, then you are dealing with uncertainty. And I say you're dealing with or you're experiencing uncertainty because I see it as a subjective term. It is, you can think about it like even in identical situations, different people would experience uncertainty differently. So it tells us that there is something internal to us in the way we define and deal with uncertainty. Now, the connection to entrepreneurship, you said it's sort of intuitive, that people say, yeah, entrepreneurship has uncertainty, but the factors that contribute to that are well, I suppose the things that we identify most with entrepreneurship, which is novelty or something new that has not existed before or has been remixed from things that do exist, but in a new way. It is mostly closely related in that sense to innovation. And I guess in the popular understanding of the term entrepreneurship or who are entrepreneurs, those are usually portrayed as people that are breaking through and introducing something completely new to the world. I think that's sort of an extreme view of what is entrepreneurship. There are much more mundane things that we can consider as entrepreneurship. But in any case, we're dealing with a person or a group of people who are trying to establish a new product, a new business in a new market sometimes. And that is where uncertainty comes in. There is more that these people don't know than what they do know.
Yes, I think it is kind of that foundation that's very important because going forward, I know we'll be diving a lot deeper into specific aspects of how entrepreneurs might be less rational, say under stress, or they might be able to use different networking strategies or perhaps not an ideal networking strategy in forming relationships under that kind of uncertainty. And I think these are all important things to consider. So could you quickly walk us through some of the reactions that entrepreneurs have to this uncertainty in terms of both the negative side of things and as well how they sometimes try to fix it?
Yeah, well, that's where uncertainty is really fascinating, I think, because people do respond to it differently. And even when I speak, and we tend to sort of, when I speak about it like this, I tend to generalize to the term entrepreneurs as if these are some kind of a unified idea of a person. Entrepreneurs are extremely different than each other, but there is something very fundamental about dealing with situations where you have this level of high uncertainty or unknowability about what the future would look like. And the thing about entrepreneurs is that they engage with it by doing something. Most of us, encounter uncertainty and don't do anything with it, right? We freeze or we turn to do something that we feel is more certain. Entrepreneurs often engage with this moment by taking action in exactly the opposite direction, right? They say, okay, that is uncertain, then I will act on it and do something. So in terms of reaction, uncertainty can be both activating and deactivating. Most of the time, for the people that I look at in my research, they've, at least in this initial decision, treated it as something activating, or at least it did not deactivate them enough to stop them. Now, in terms of the kind of logic that implies for their decisions, there's a series of actions that almost any entrepreneur need to take when they start a business, right? You need to have some kind of an idea of what you're doing, what you're offering. You need to have some concept of who it is intended to. You need to maybe, again, form relationships to other people, present yourself to other people, eventually maybe also sell your idea or your dream to other people who might come in as employees or investors or partners, not to mention customers, the biggest group, hopefully. From what we learn from how entrepreneurs deal with these decisions, there is this emergent, I'm aware that I'm overly generalizing here, but like I would divide it in these two modes of doing things. One is I think you mentioned the term rational before. So what we mostly consider rational is this sort of very orderly process of collecting information about something I want to make a decision about, making some predictions, establishing what is my goal, and according to that, sort of look down at a series of actions of what do I need to do in order to get there. And that's one way, and that's applicable in some decisions. But because we define uncertainty as this sort of sense that you cannot predict the future, how do you act then? If your goals are not so clear that you can deduct some actions to get to them, you need some other logic to operate with. And there is great work by Sarah Saraswati and a bunch of other scholars who came up with this model of what expert entrepreneurs do in these moments. They call it effectuation. At a very basic level, that just means that their engagement with uncertainty is directly opposite to this mode of prediction. Instead of predicting, you need to come up with some other way to influence or control the future. And the way that expert entrepreneurs, and I would sort of broaden that to some entrepreneurs, because some non-experts engage in this kind of thinking as well. It means that they act with the information that they have, which means that by acting, they're generating more information, and that is then used subsequently to make future decisions, which might crystallize at some point into a very clear goal. Once you know something about the future or where you want to get to, you can more accurately predict some certain things. But the sort of core starting point is trading off this predictability for direct action. Maybe an example would be at a very, very early stage. So assuming that you know that you would like to start a business around some idea, but that idea is still very unclear. What most people do is that they talk to other people to try and clarify this for them. They might talk to themselves for a little bit, but at some point you might talk to other people. Now, by going and talking to other people freely about your ideas, you get some input and maybe some people that will eventually be involved as well, and you get to clarify, whatever it is into some kind of a goal and eventually some kind of a venture or a business, a startup. If at the beginning of that, instead of going to the people you know and discussing these ideas, you would say, well, I don't actually know what I'm talking about, I'm having a hard time explaining it, you will end up not doing anything. Or you will make up, and that's even worse, you will think you know what you're doing, you will make grand predictions about where you want to end up with, and sort of end up asking people or talking to people about it when it's too late and you invested too much resources, money and time and effort into it. So that's what, for me, effectuation is about. Logic of acting under uncertainty with a trade-off between accuracy and a way to control the future by actually interacting with it.
Mm-hmm. And when we consider this, obviously it's ideal that entrepreneurs are able to understand that when they are in uncertainty, they should be able to change how they're making decisions so that they can deal with the lack of information and move forward with it instead of, say, being stuck or turning away, as most people would if they haven't trained this kind of ability. And when we look at the landscape of solutions out there, and by solutions I mean what are the different interventions entrepreneurs can take when they realize that they're facing this uncertainty and they don't have all the information they need, I think an emerging area of focus is in the ability to kind of, first of all, control your emotions and fear, especially in reaction to that. And reading some of your research, I was looking at how fear can be obstructive to being able to make good decisions in everyday activities that entrepreneurs engage in. And I was also looking at some of the new solutions being proposed here in terms of the effects of things like meditation. So I'd love to ask you about the landscape of solutions there, and in particular, the role of meditation in being able to address this.
Sure. So I suppose that the side of uncertainty that I haven't, as you pointed out, that I haven't been talking about yet is that it also makes people uncomfortable. Not knowing the future or what might happen can cause quite a lot of anxiety. It's quite usual that entrepreneurs deal with a high level of stress and even fear about the future. And that's, of course, becoming worse when you actually decided to take an action about setting up a business. For most people, that's type of activity means also a lot of weight in terms of their lives, right? They put their time and money and take risk in their career and actually risk their relationship with everybody they know because they cannot stop talking about this new thing they're doing. And all that sort of boils down to something that they're not sure about and that nobody can give them this certainty about it. So indeed, they are dealing with a lot of fear. And in my study, I looked at a specific form of fear, which is fear of failure. because a lot of these activities are around doing things where the outcome is unclear. So success or failure are really ambiguous when you are acting on it and you don't know what will happen. And indeed, there are several ways to deal with this fear. Now, it is important to say, I think you shortly mentioned it in your question, that fear is actually not necessarily all bad. From a sort of a cognitive perspective, fear is a signal. It conveys some information, right? It tells you that something that you would like to achieve is in some kind of danger or threat. So from that perspective, that is very useful information. For most of us, fear is a good thing. If we were all fearless, we would be in trouble, paradoxically. But specifically for entrepreneurs, and I guess we can generalize it also to other environments of just simply being human, since we're in 2020 and things are uncertain for all of us, a lot of the fears that we are dealing with are not necessarily materializing, right? So fear of failure is not the same as failure, yet we experience it, we sort of time travel and experience it as if we are preparing ourselves for actual failure. Now, if you're an entrepreneur, you deal with this a lot, maybe to a dysfunctional level sometimes, so that indeed they need to have some ways of regulating their responses to fear. And I'm saying their responses because it's not necessarily regulating fear. It is not the intention in this type of self-regulation is not to feel less of fear or to completely ignore it, but it's to process it and to react to it in a different way. And through meditation, which was one of the focus of my studies on that, is a way to deal with fear, to sort of reconstruct our response to it in a way that is perhaps better for what we end up doing or deciding. In the study that I did about that, we used a particular kind of meditation called loving kindness meditation. And the rationale for using that type of intervention was the great base of evidence connecting this type of meditation specifically to something called self-compassion. And the idea behind it was that if we can induce self-compassion in entrepreneurs, that should influence their fear reactivity if they encounter some kind of a threatening situation. Of course, we do that within the context of entrepreneurship. So when I say a threat, this is not a lion jumping at them from the bushes, but it's more about some kind of a threat to their business, which elicits fear. Self-compassion itself is an extremely interesting construct. It involves 3 different components. Mindful acceptance, which refers to some kind of a balance or an awareness of thoughts and feelings that gives you a little bit of distance between yourself and these thoughts. And of course, as the name suggests, it also relates to mindfulness. The second dimension of self-compassion is common humanity, which is the acknowledgement that you're a human being. There are others like you who are maybe suffering like you. So it gives you a bit of, again, a sense of perspective of being part of some collective. And the third dimension is self-kindness, which is just the ability to treat yourself with some understanding and forgiveness when things are not working out so well. This is all based on great work by Kirsten Neff, who's a scholar working a lot with self-compassion, but it also goes back, and that's a nice connection to meditation, to sort of to Buddhist teaching. So it all sort of connects nicely the history of these constructs that for thousands of years has been an established practice to cultivate self-compassion with the meditation practice. And what I've tried to do in my study is to simply apply this wisdom, these theories, to the context where entrepreneurs deal with difficulties. And indeed, what we find is that even in a very brief few minutes of meditation, it is possible to make entrepreneurs feel more self-compassionate, and that this has, I would say, a good influence on their reactions to fear, because it reduced their sort of emotional reaction to fear, while not reducing their recognition of a threat. So we were able to sort of tease out in this study this reaction on a level of like people feel less fearful, but they would still recognize that there is something that they need to attend to. The signal was still there. So I find that promising, but of course I also have to qualify this. Studies like this, like the one I was doing, are experimental studies that are done in conditions that are not always, they're dealing with hypothetical scenarios and so on, with a very brief meditation, but it makes to prove a point, to show some kind of a psychological mechanism that is, of course, more important if people actually practice meditation over time, because that sort of strengthens these mechanisms and making them habitual, which is potentially a lot more rewarding for entrepreneurs dealing with uncertainty.
I think this is a very important point for not just entrepreneurs, but people in general that deal with uncertainty. And to transition from this kind of work, I finally just wanted to ask you a series of questions about your personal experiences with conducting research like this and some of the implications that you're thinking about going forward. So I'll just ask a series of rapid fire questions. First of all being, when you're trying to conduct these studies, what are some of the activities that you must engage in to find relevant participants, separate experts versus novice entrepreneurs, etc.?
Yeah, so the greatest challenge I would think to do research with entrepreneurs is that entrepreneurs are not known for having a lot of extra time to fill up surveys, sit in the lab, or listen to audio meditation or other things that I let them do. So of course, a huge challenge is in actually recruiting relevant participants for these studies. And in addition to that, I might say I have some other experience, for example, with more qualitative research with entrepreneurs, where we interview entrepreneurs in person. And of course, then they're very, very happy to talk about themselves for a very long time. But there are drawbacks to both types of research designs. And most of the time, I do struggle to convince people to participate in this type of studies.
Mm-hmm. And regarding your personal connection with the entrepreneurs, do you feel like sometimes you're able to, one, offer them personal insight by saying there are these things that we're studying, how you can make decisions in this different way or meditate that might help you, but then to also receive the same thing from them. So maybe after this kind of research, you feel like you have better insight into, if you wanted to be an entrepreneur, how you might approach that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a two-way street. I see it most clearly with my students. So I don't only do research, but I also teach entrepreneurship. I have students who start their own businesses. So part of this connection with meditation practice, for example, or generally self-regulation comes in courses that I teach. And I see that when I spend 6 months around these young students that are starting on their own venture, I get to learn a lot of things, both about my own theories about how things should work and about what they can teach me. And that's the same also with the entrepreneurs who participate in my studies. I surely learn a lot from them. I cannot really say, it's always the question that comes up. So now that you know all this, why don't you start on your own? So I would just say that you learn a lot of things about entrepreneurship as a lifestyle. And this is full of things that are positive as well as negative. So everybody can make their decision about whether to jump into that.
Mm-hmm. I think the saying somewhat goes, the more you know about entrepreneurship, the less you want to actually do it.
Yeah, I suppose that there is some truth to that. It's either that or the saying that those who can't do teach,
I think it's a little bit unfair in that sense, but I do think you have valuable insight to offer people. And in that regards, what would you say are some of the things that you might advise other entrepreneurs or just people in general that might be facing a lot of uncertainty to be able to get over this or better manage this?
So the first thing I think I would advise is to explore within yourself and the situations you're in and try to clearly separate what in the situation is actually controllable. It's up to your actions and what is not. Entrepreneurs are quite consistent in ignoring the things that they cannot change or influence, but going full on the things they can. And I think I've learned a lot from that. The second thing is to also explore this in terms of what type of logic or way of thinking or way of doing things do you want to fit to a certain situation. The truth is that even in entrepreneurship world, most of the time you are dealing with high uncertainty situations. Not all situations and conditions are on high uncertainty. So if you just you've got a hammer and the world becomes a nail, that's a problem. You need to be sort of dynamically reevaluating the match between what you're doing and what the situation calls for. That's another thing, and that sort of relates to my current research interest, which is a specific decision or set of decisions where all the stuff that I just talked about in terms of how to entrepreneurs effectively take decisions under uncertainty by doing this type of trade-offs and acting fast to generate more information. All of this collapses more or less when you're dealing with hiring people, with growing the organization. So this is a really prime example of where what's good at the beginning tends to become less and less good as you grow a company.
Definitely. And when it comes to going forward with what you're working on, this brings me to my last question, which is, what are some of the largest gaps in what we know when it comes to how entrepreneurs behave under uncertainty? And then where are you most excited to be working on in the next 5 years, let's say, to be able to address those gaps?
There are gaps everywhere in our knowledge of how people deal with uncertainty, despite of many, many, many years and really good science on how to do things. It seems like always there is something we have not considered before, or something surprising that the world is presenting us with a new set of problems. And so I think there's just sort of, it's not 5 years, but probably 500 years of trying to figure out how to deal with situations effectively. Where I find right now most exciting is what I just mentioned, this topic of hiring in startups and scaling, especially as it intersects with issues of diversity and inclusion. This type of logic that causes you to trade off some predictive power for immediate action need to be switched at some point when you're thinking about the future of an organization. So just to be more concrete about it, when building a company, like with any other decisions, entrepreneurs tend to prioritize speed, which means that they are making a lot of decisions about who are their early co-founders and early employees. And that tends to be driven by availability, because speed means I'm looking around me to the people I know, people that feel that they fit to what I want. And that creates most of the time quite homogeneous starting point for a company. Startups tend to be quite homogeneous to start with. They're similar in terms of their backgrounds, their age, even things like gender and race, right? They even think alike. And they're actively being selected for thinking alike because it's more comfortable. I think that we see it more and more that the startups that do end up growing, they grow despite of that and not because of that. They grow because they have an excellent product, but then at a certain point later on, they get stuck with the idea of okay, we are a lot of people that are similar. We do not necessarily represent the social environment around us, which creates friction. And once you're very large as a company, this friction is very, very difficult to resolve. It's very hard to change. So I find a lot of fascinating research directions in looking at what happens early on in startups and how that sort of influences the evolution of an organization.
Yeah, I think it's really, really insightful to hear about how much there still is to discover in this, not just in terms of specific concepts, in terms of what's about this emotion, what about that emotion, what about this situation, but then thinking about how all of that completely gets shuffled around as the organization grows, as more people come in, and it just shows how much more exciting room there is for more discovery here. So I really wanted to thank you for taking the time to talk about all of these insightful things and just showcase how much more there is to learn here.
Thank you very much. It was wonderful to have the opportunity to answer your questions. I wish I was that curious when I was your age.